class, we are back looking at the way in which we understand epistemology, still with Manuel Velasquez in the context of Immanuel Kant. And so the chapter for this reading is titled, Does the Knowing Mind Shape the World? Featuring Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant was an Enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century. So he was born in 1723 and dies in 1804. And so we must never forget, in the context of Immanuel Kant, the context of Immanuel Kant is as an Enlightenment thinker during what is known as the Age of Reason, in other words, the Enlightenment. And so, yet we must always recognize that Kant's philosophical/epistemological work is a critical re-evaluation of reasoning itself, otherwise known as the Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781. And so to you and I, this reads as a criticism into the way in which we understand reasoning itself, and likewise the limitations of reasoning. So in the book, he famously drew out distinctions in which we need to understand the limits of reason, and so that places our understanding of philosophy and likewise scientific thinking into a way in which we understand things in a foundational sense. So, in other words, his job was to clarify reason. And Kant was also obviously not interested in just philosophy, but also scientific thinking, that this was a way to philosophically ground a better understanding of reason in terms of science. Kant was known for his Kant-Laplace theory, or otherwise known as nebular hypothesis, or his nebular hypothesis. And this is really a way in which he was understanding the birth of the solar system as originating in particles and gases that are rotating in a gravitational field so as to form what we know of now as the planets. And so his difficulty rests in his precision. In other words, Immanuel Kant, when you read him, he is notoriously difficult, but yet at the same time, that difficulty is a result of his aim toward precision, indeed extreme precision. And always recall too that Kant's deontology, his moral philosophy, should still be held together with his epistemology. In other words, they're both part of his grand Enlightenment project, otherwise known as Transcendental Idealism. So here we'll touch on the specifics of what Transcendental Idealism actually is as an epistemological position, specifically to Kant, and extending to the thinking of German idealists such as J.G. Fichte, also F.W.J. Schelling, and culminating in the great G.W.F. Hegel, by way of Hegel's absolute Geist, or absolute spirit. And also, too, we need to understand what transcendental idealism actually means. So the word transcendental could also be coupled with an understanding of how it is that we understand things metaphysically at its base. In other words, metaphysics could mean going beyond physics, and transcendental also means going beyond. But as we pointed out when we understood metaphysics, we still should at least recognize that the going beyond is not necessarily going beyond the things themselves, in the sense that we're escaping those things, but rather that, so in other words, we never really hold the things, the elements and objects of our thoughts in our minds literally. We simply are using our mind to understand those things. So those things are never held in our mind literally. They are really objects of thought. And those objects of thought are another way of understanding something ideally. So the term idealism is a way in which we're characterizing our understanding of reality and the world around us as a function of the mind. So in other words, reality and the world around us exists simply because we think about it. It does not exist exterior to that, or at least not in a full sense. Kant did account for things that exist outside of our cognition. He referred to those things as the things in themselves. But he is not recognizing that outside of our thinking is a substantial world unto itself. And so whenever we're making that connection, that's understood as realism. So he is not a realist, he is an idealist. And so, in other words, this transcendental idealism of his is a perfect confluence of empirical epistemology tied in with rational epistemology. So in other words, as much as Kant is considering the role of reason in our understanding of things, he is not a strict rationalist as Descartes or Leibniz were. And so we want to start with how it is that we're understanding Hume's challenge to causation. In other words, David Hume's empirical challenge to epistemology had to do with this idea that when we look at causation, in other words, a cause brings about the effect of something else, there is not a necessary connection between the two. So Hume was skeptical of the necessary connection between cause and effect. And the interesting thing here is that this idea, this connection, essentially brought Kant to awaken from his dogmatic slumbers, as he famously put it. So what that means is that as Kant was studying Hume, he suddenly was awakened from his dogmatic slumbers to recognize that empirically, in other words, when we are experiencing the world perceptually, we do not have something that is a reasonable necessity that is perceptually detectable between cause and effect. Okay? So, in other words, we are the ones that are supplying the necessary connection by virtue of our reasoning capacity. Okay? So even though Kant agrees with Hume's epistemology, he didn't entirely agree that our way of acquiring knowledge of the world rested entirely on sense impressions or with sense perception alone. So, for example, remember that every action must always cause an equal and opposite reaction is Newton's third law of motion. And so this is a close follow-up in a way in which we're understanding that a cause and effect is understood by our rational knowledge of cause and effect. And yet we need to key into the problem of rational necessity that Hume relegated to mere habit. So Newton's third law is rational necessity, and so with no exception. Then Hume denied this necessary connection that is problematized with Hume's problem of induction. So that's another thing just to recognize too, is that Newton came about his way of understanding the laws of nature by which to serve as a foundation for scientific thinking. in a rational way. So there's a strong rationalist component to Newton's understanding of scientific foundation. And so this is problematized with Hume's problem of induction, whereby we don't always have a guarantee that past events will resemble future events. So Kant agreed that, for instance, with geometric mathematics, the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line, for example. And then in terms of the natural sciences, every event must have a cause. And Kant also agrees that we go beyond perception in order to rationally understand perception, or likewise to understand these principles, or these rational principles. So these rules are what Kant termed synthetic a priori statements. So a synthetic a priori statement is the idea that every event must have a cause, or the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line, okay? So when we're understanding a synthetic statement, this gives us information about the world, and as a priori statement is only reliant on our reasoning, as with the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. So in other words, the way in which we're understanding things analytically is inherently an a priori understanding of the world, and when we're understanding things in terms of that which is a priori, we're saying that this is knowledge that we have of the world that is prior to experience, but also too, when we're identifying something as a priori reasoning, we're also recognizing that this is having to do with our pure reasoning. In other words, it's strictly reasonable, as opposed to having the component of empirical experience or empirical perception. So what you're wanting to identify there is that with synthetic understanding, we are tying that into a posteriori recognition of the world. In other words, such terms account for ways in which we have empirical knowledge. And then with terms like analytic and a priori, these terms are ways in which we account for our rational knowledge. So, and also ways in which we know things that are beyond the senses. In other words, understood by way of reason. And so as Velasquez writes, for Kant, he noticed that something that both the empiricists and the rationalists missed, and that is that sensations stream from our senses, yet we do not experience a mere chaotic display of sensations streaming through us. So in other words, when we perceive things, the perception of those things is automatically tied and overlapped with the way in which we're understanding the things rationally, or in a priori sense. So in other words, a synthetic a priori statement is the confluence of how it is that we're understanding a statement in terms of our a priori understanding, our analytic understanding, tied in with synthesis to our empirical perceptual experience of things. So in other words, to experience things perceptually, we are also simultaneously and overlapping the way in which we're understanding things rationally. So in other words, as we continue to point out, reason is organizational in terms of logic, and reason is a way in which we are looking at the law-like ways in which we account for such things as the natural laws of science. So in other words, there's always a strong scientific and mathematical epistemology in Kant's philosophy. Indeed, he was critiquing pure reason in order to establish a basis for a better account of the rational foundations for math and science. So similarly to the way in which Descartes was working, except that Kant was not a strict rationalist as Descartes was. Kant was accounting for the way in which we understand things empirically and rationally simultaneously. So, for example, we find corollaries in our knowledge of space and time. So for Kant, our understanding of space is usually thought of as outside of us, as exterior to thinking. Yet for Kant, space is not a concept, given that all occurrences of our understanding of space have the idea of space as prior to all considerations of measuring and identifying space. So in other words, any way that we're understanding spatial connections in terms of quantification of space geometrically, so on and so forth, always includes a way in which we understand space reasonably, or by way of our cognition, before we look at space or experience space to begin with. In other words, it's our understanding of space is a priori to perceptual experience. And so, in other words, our idea or our rationalization of space is already there before we conceptualize things in space to begin with. So this is akin to our rational aim of geometry and our way of rationally delimiting and measuring space perceptually. So the same thinking accords to Kant's understanding of time itself. So in other words, as with space, time for Kant is not a concept, given that all ways in which we have knowledge of time always and necessarily have the idea of time there to begin with, in a cognitive way, preceding any concept of how it is that we understand time and the temporal perceptual way in which we experience things sensually. So, in other words, time precedes all concepts of it. So therefore, it is not a concept. In other words, all concepts of time contain the way in which we know about time in a rational way. And that's also to identify a sense of time as and space, both time and space, as inherently rational. And likewise, to recognize this in a transcendental, idealist way is also to understand that we are the ones that bring our understanding of space and time to our experience of the world perceptually, not the other way around. Because usually what we think is that we perceive the world and that's how it is that we understand time, or we perceive and experience the world and that's the way we understand space, but it's the other way around. We bring space, the ideas of space and time, to all of our concepts of space and time perceptually and experientially. Okay, so I'm going to leave you there, and we'll talk more about this later. And thank you, and have a fantastic day.